I adore the Breath of Fire series. Like most fans, I have a huge soft spot for the first 4 games and was beyond disappointed with what the 5th entry became. Something about the daunting vagueness and unforgiving nature was a huge barrier to entry for someone looking for a casual, light-hearted JRPG romp. To try to make sense of where it all went wrong, I began delving into what little information I could find about the development of Dragon Quarter. I stumbled upon an intriguing interview with the director Makoto Ikihara and the character designer Tetsuya Yoshikawa, and it shed some light on why Dragon Quarter ended up a mangled chore of a game. I'll only be referencing a small section of the interview, so if you want to read the full thing, and I strongly urge you do, you'll find a link in the description. All credit goes to RPGFan.com for hosting it, translating it, and allowing me to use it for this video. So a few of the answers that really stuck out to me were in regards to the proposed goals of Dragon Quarter and the justification for them. The first question reads, "This time you have created a new Breath of Fire title on the PS2. What goals did you set?" The director responded, "First and foremost, we thought, let's change Breath of Fire. The platform changed and the visuals weren't dot-by-dot pictures anymore, but rather 3D CG. There's nothing wrong with wanting to spice up a consistent series of games, but to go into a majestic series such as Breath of Fire with the prioritized goal of changing it seems like a huge red flag to me. I've always praised developers who attempt to make something fresh within a sequel even if they fail, but at the same time, any major or drastic change will likely alienate the people who enjoyed the earlier entries. And I think we can say, with our superior power of hindsight, that Dragon Quarter did alienate plenty of Breath of Fire fans. One of the reasons this happened is directly addressed in the next answer. The interviewer states, "There are a lot of people who don't die in games nowadays, but in this Breath of Fire title, you're constantly on the brink of death." To this, the character designer responded, "The series' previous installment, Breath of Fire 4, was a game where you rarely got annihilated, so this was probably a reaction to that fact." The director followed this up with, "In older games, you did get annihilated pretty often, didn't you? And yet, this too was a good memory. After all, isn't the essence of a game's thrill also in the game over?" These are some fantastic points. Breath of Fire 4 is one of my favourite games, easily in my top 5, but it's not difficult at all. While a strong narrative, a nice progression curve, and beautiful art can carry a game, there wasn't much challenge to be found in the 4th entry, and without that threat of loss, there was very few instances where you'll feel rewarded through gameplay. It seems that the focus of Dragon Quarter was to constantly force the player into uncomfortable situations where they'd rarely have a moment to rest and would have to exert their knowledge and utilize the minimal resources to secure survival at all costs. This was done by restricting many elements of JRPGs we typically take for granted in order to give the player a feeling of actual challenge and to enhance the rewarding feeling of a struggle. With all this said, I played Dragon Quarter again recently and found it to be almost exactly as described. For the past decade and a half, I could not stand the game and have shit-talked it to anyone who would listen, which is unfortunate as I now think it's a worthwhile experience. While it's still an ill-fitting Breath of Fire title, there's a lot of good shit contained within. I'm going to talk about the story and various elements in the game which may spoil the experience for you. I will be relatively vague with unimportant detail, but if you don't want to take the risk, then bugger off and play it for yourself first. You've been warned. Here we go! The entire in-game world takes place in an underground facility which runs thousands of meters deep and consists of destroyed malls, dilapidated cities, and other depressing scenery. Being so deep into the earth, the air quality is abysmal, and it gets worse the farther down you are. You play as Ryu, surprise surprise, a low-level grunt who works for a government agency and is sent on a mission to escort some cargo with your high-ranking chum, Bosch. After becoming separated from Bosch and discovering that the cargo was actually a winged child named Nina, you team up with resistance fighter Lin and agree to escort Nina to safety. During this trek, Ryu encounters his old buddy Bosch, who, unhappy with Ryu's unexplained white knighting, pierces him through the neck, awakening his dragon powers, which allows the party to escape. This opening is brilliant. The story in and of itself is pretty weak, and I'll get to why in just a little bit, but these few scenes tell us everything we need to know about the primary characters. The facial expressions displayed by Bosch as he's antagonizing Ryu make you despise him. His smug ruthlessness shocks everybody and shows how quick he is to discard a comrade if it will further his own goals. Ryu grapples with the idea of his own death as he surrenders to the will of a dragon who effectively grants him immortality along with vast power. Because Nina's a mute, all you get are facial expressions, but they convey the bond which is already formed in the short time the party's been together. And of course, Lin is a good girl who does what she's told. And the overall story breaks down like this. Humans are ranked by a caste system called D ratio, and the lower it is, the lower affinity you have with dragons, which determines your value in society. What kicks off the current story is that the government kidnapped Nina, who had such a low D ratio that nobody would notice her missing, and then experimented on her in an attempt to turn her into a human air filter. They severed her vocal cords and implanted filters in the shape of wings to purify the air. This design takes a major toll on Nina and is pretty much a death sentence. I'd say my only major gripe with this is the harsh contrast to how she acts in battle. In one cutscene, Nina may be fainting and struggling to breathe, yet 10 seconds later she'll be conjuring balls of ice and running around like nothing's wrong. Granted, having any form of reliable inconsistency in battle would be a chore, but from a story perspective, you never get the feeling that her ailment is a big issue. Anyway, upon figuring out that Nina has the black lung, Ryu makes it his duty, ostensibly through a will built on sheer contrarianism, to keep Nina alive. The only way to achieve this is to get her to the surface of the Earth and get some fresh air up inside her. This is never confirmed, but simply speculated to be the best course of action. Of course, various forces come out in a vain attempt to stop you, and they're all given minimal to no backstory. None of them really matter, and most are introduced as you fight them. To make matters worse, they set up plenty of scenarios with potential to be great, but which never go anywhere. For example, the leader of the resistance group is meant to be an extremely powerful person with a high D ratio, but he doesn't contribute in any significant way. He simply guides Ryu to the next point in the story and then fucks off. In this regard, Bosch is the only redeemable antagonist, and arguably the only redeemable character in the game. He starts off as a controllable character who may not have the best intentions, but who is certainly an ally to Ryu. After the aforementioned scuffle with the whole neck stabbing incident, he walks away defeated and begins a rapid descent into madness. Eventually, he reaches the point where he's barely recognizable, both in a physical and mental sense, and while these moments aren't impactful in any meaningful way, they are believable. A high-ranked soldier was bested by a low rank, and despite Bosch's best effort, he is constantly being one-upped by what he sees as scum. No matter how much of his humanity he gives up, he simply cannot triumph over Ryu, and to Bosch, this is impossible. This drives him to insanity and ultimately destroys him. Additional scenes can be unlocked on repeat playthroughs, which is the attempted justification for making the game so challenging, and while you'll probably want to restart from the beginning at least once. It's a nice attempt at a bizarre mechanic, but a handful of new scenes isn't enough to justify going back to the beginning of the game. While it is a pain in the ass, it still sheds some much needed light on certain characters and events. Through these cutscenes, we find that Bosch was traumatized as a child by his father, so his smug, cunty demeanor is not entirely his fault. Upon discovering this, I felt kinda bad for him, before promptly kicking his teeth in. And in that regard, I think Dragon Quarter achieves something that many games fail to do. That is, it allows the player to empathize with the antagonist, even if only for a moment. I personally think that's what makes a believable antagonist, and why I adore the former games so much. Despite the story and general character motivations being pretty shit, the atmosphere more than makes up for it. If you've played any Breath of Fire game before, you'll know that they typically have a whimsical, lighthearted exterior, but lurking beneath the surface is a dark narrative filled to the brim with challenging quandaries. Dragon Quarter does away with the bright comfort that the series is typically known for and opts for a more dismal approach. A handful of maps are extremely dim to the point where you can barely see directly in front of you. Oftentimes you'll be looking for glowing eyes in the foreground to prevent a spooky monster mash. Those few maps are fantastic and force you to play more conservatively, but existing alongside them are areas that are well lit and still manage to retain that unnatural feel. There are few games that valiantly capture this dark, eerie atmosphere. Even plenty of horror games completely fail at it, but Dragon Quarter excels and is not ashamed to shove it in your face. I'd compare the unique feel it emits to another treasured game, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, which I constantly jerk off for the unique atmosphere it boasts, among other things. Accompanying this atmospheric tension is this little polarizing figure here known as the D counter. This is one of the main reasons so many people were soured on Dragon Quarter, because when it hits 100%, you get a game over. The game over system is interesting in that you almost certainly will encounter it, and when you do, you have the option to load a previous save. However, this will remove whatever items you had in your inventory along with your currency, and your D counter returns to whatever value it was the last time you saved. The alternative to this is that you can start the game from scratch to reset the counter to 0. Granted, when you start from the beginning, you can keep whatever items you stored in the bank, your current equipment, any abilities you've learned, and something known as party experience, which you earn alongside regular experience. Party experience acts just like regular experience, but can be assigned independently and at your own discretion. A repeat playthrough doesn't sound like a big ask, especially considering the game's only 6 to 8 hours long for a first time through, and there are benefits to starting from the beginning with gear from a previous playthrough. However, because of the way the D counter works, it can be pretty fucking annoying. The D counter fills up gradually over the course of your journey. It goes up 0.01% roughly every 10 to 20 steps. It also goes up 0.01% for every turn Ryu takes in battle. Even though it would take close to 150,000 steps or 10,000 turns in battle to hit the cap, which is almost impossible, it still feels like there's a tight leash around you. There's a weird tension whenever you take an extra turn or do a little bit of exploring, even though realistically it won't affect much. On top of this, there's an ability called D-Dash, which allows you to run through enemies and avoid a battle with them, but it increases the D counter at a growing rate the longer you hold it. This is extremely useful, but because of how useful it is, there is a harsh penalty for relying too heavily on it. Finally, we have D-Dive, which allows Ryu to transform into a dragon. This form is ridiculously powerful, as it's capable of killing every boss in the game with only a few hits. D-Dive, much like D-Dash, is balanced by increasing your D counter at an alarming rate. The ability to get out of any situation with ease is diminished by the fact that it rapidly increases your D counter, and an over-reliance on this form will see you having to replay chunks of the game. This is why I cited the second answer from the interview earlier on. In previous Breath of Fire titles, the Dragon Power was either a hefty short-term cost for a big attack, or a sustained form which gradually drained your AP, which is the Breath of Fire equivalent of MP. The effects of both of these Dragon Powers were recovered by resting or using items. Dragon Quarter took that and flipped it on its head by giving transformation a permanent consequence, and while I hated this limitation in past playthroughs, after giving it another chance, I'm on board now. This is how strong a dragon should be. I've always found it strange in previous games where a dragon form isn't much stronger than the human form, but not in Dragon Quarter. This thing will kick the shit out of everything with little issue. In any given encounter, falling back on D-Dive or even avoiding an encounter with D-Dash could be a necessity, and because of the negative consequences, it keeps battle and general movement tense. You're often trying your hardest to avoid using them by any means necessary, which may see you dip a little too hard into the limited resources available to you. When you also factor in that saving isn't something you can do carelessly and a slower player will have to be selective with when and where they save, there's never a moment where you feel at ease about any given decision, unless you're playing a European copy. To add to all of this, there aren't many places to stop and take a break, and when you do find a place, your D counter's still sitting up in the top corner, slowly working its way to 100%. There's no real reason to stop other than to stock up on items or change equipment around, and I like that there's a good forward motion to the gameplay. It helps string the minimal story elements together pretty well and avoids feeling all disjointed, which is something plenty of JRPGs suffer from. It also helps keep the feeling of urgency that the narrative is just begging the player to feel. I'm actually impressed with how far the devs went to avoid traditional JRPG staples and use their new approach to do some interesting shit. For example, certain enemies have particular patterns I'd almost call personality traits. Early on, there's this big pig-looking thing who typically roams with gangs of smaller pigs. If you encounter one of these enemies by themselves, or you dispatch all of the wee baby piggies, the larger one gets scared and attempts to flee. There's other enemies like this, such as thieves who approach the party, steal an item, and then fuck off as fast as they can. In a game where you've got limited inventory slots, going up against a few of these can put you in a really bad place. I love that you are rarely in a comfortable situation, and enemies like this exemplify how dynamic Dragon Quarter feels despite being almost entirely static. I was also thinking about the combat system, more specifically the magic system, and how a slight tweak made it fit perfectly into the game. Before combat, you can make preparations for the impending battle, such as laying traps and bait for monsters. In combat, you can move around somewhat freely and are only bound by your AP, which depletes as you move. AP is also what's used for attacks. This adds a great trade-off system where you're forced to use the same currency, so to speak, for both movement and actions. It forces you to think about shit before you do it. Now, the magic is a little bit special, because when you picture magic in JRPGs, you typically think that a set amount of MP will cast a spell which has an immediate effect on a target. Dragon Quarter could have simply left it at that and said, yeah, that's good enough, whatever. However, they've added an area-based trap that can be cast and is triggered upon enemies walking into it. Not only does this fit the trap and bait mechanics already present, but it works as a predictive area-based method for either dishing out damage or controlling parts of the map. Most trap-based magic also has a secondary effect further impeding enemy actions, which is brilliant. It adds an objective benefit over standard magic, and an incentive to not just ass blast enemies with whatever hits the hardest. So just to close, I never thought I'd be jerking Dragon Quarter off, and if you've played it before and aren't the biggest fan of it, I'd urge you to give it another chance. It does have problems, some very glaring problems, but even with all that, it's still a tense atmospheric delight that should have been a building block for the future of the series and not a death sentence. I think the contrasting styles of Dragon Quarter and what the original games had to offer would have been a nice complementary mix to prevent the series from growing stale. I would have loved to have seen a sequel to this, to see if they could have done something really special with it, and I'd take a series of Dragon Quarters over whatever the fuck Breath of Fire 6 was. Anyway, thanks for watching, fuck Capcom, and I'll see you next time.